Okay, so actually I'm in there myself.
Yep.
So I guess I'll present them. Is that what you're all seeing? No, I'm not sharing my screen. Okay, but you can see them all. So yeah, I just absolutely want to talk about teachers' attitudes towards games in the EFL classroom. And when I announced that this was what I was doing, I think I took on a bit too much to chew because obviously my frame of reference is very narrow. But I was thinking the exact same thing that you just said about the previous two presentations, that this really piggybacks on them, because you guys, Fabio and Ben, are talking about how we can draw connections between teachers and game masters, or as dungeon masters. And I'm backing up the question and asking, well, how do we get teachers to have that frame of mind that they even want to be game masters or dungeon masters or use games? And you can go to slide 2. What I focus on are their attitudes, but attitudes is a catch-all word for 1,000 different things. So some people call them habits, values, perceptions, ways of thinking. And these attitudes touch on, obviously, 1,000 things. So we can talk about your habits that you grew up with, but we can also talk about the habits of what the culture is in your school. And beyond that, we can talk about what's the culture of your English department or your foreign language department, or what's the habit or the beliefs about, for example, playful approaches to learning, or about technology. So attitudes is very, very vague, and obviously encompasses a lot of things. And they're all conceptualized differently in the literature, which makes it really hard to kind of research and pin down, because depending on what research tradition you're in, you have to make sure you're looking through the right attitude lens, even though they're really obviously all very closely related. And then you have to layer those attitudes, and you can go to slide 3. You have to layer those attitudes onto their assumptions or attitudes about teaching and learning. And of course, these all interact with each other. There's been a lot of talk in the last year or so about intersectionality. And I think this is also an intersectional issue, because you need to look at, for example, what's their assumption or their belief about the role of the teacher. And that's going to affect how they use games in the classroom, or how they think about using games in the classroom. So for example, you guys have been talking about, TBLT. So a teacher who adopts a TBLT philosophy is probably going to be a lot more inclined to using something like a game in the classroom than a teacher who has a more teacher-centered approach. But you also need to think about their beliefs about what students should be doing in the classroom and how they conceive that relationship with learners. So in Germany, which is my context, which is why this is really very narrow, teachers believe there should be a great deal of distance between them and their learners, that getting too close to learners' interests is going to detract from the teaching and learning arrangement. So you really are looking at a lot of different layers of culture and habits and attitudes, and only then can you understand why teachers are or are not willing to serve as game masters or dungeon masters or facilitators of game-based language teaching and learning. So there's nothing new under the sun. It all comes down to the individual teacher and their beliefs and attitudes. And I'm just trying to pin that down a little bit to try and understand it better, because we know from the research, as said in the introductions, and now I forget exactly who it was. Sorry, I don't want to say the wrong person. Maybe it was Adam, that we know from the research that game-based learning can be effective, and yet we see a lot of resistance to it, both from teachers and from learners. So the question is, why do we see that resistance? And it's because we need to really look at all of these different underlying beliefs, attitudes, assumptions, and their interaction and their intersection and how they influence one another. And if you're interested about reading more about that topic, I put together a list of references. You're free to keep these, look at these, or follow up with more questions with me at any time. And that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Yeah, there's a lot of papers here that I don't know, so my my favorite Russian website's going to be getting some visits in the next few days.
I don't think she's in Russia this month. I think it's somewhere else in Eastern Europe right now.
So you know what I'm talking about then.
So, like, Carol, do you get the sense that you're kind of zeroing in on like some sort of pressure point or some sort? I don't want to be too aggressive, but like some place where, with the right information or attitude shift, like it's very hard because I don't even know what your like attitude is such a weird word as well, right? It's another one of those.
Yeah.
So
vague terms, yeah.
It's very vague. So is there a place where there could be a place for teachers to shift their attitudes? Like, are you interested in how that happens or how that could happen?
Yeah, I'm interested in it, but I'm not very I'm not very optimistic about it in the current I'm in Germany.
Yeah.
That's very Germanic. Yeah, I mean, my other job is trying to get teachers to accept kids with special educational needs, so ADD or with motor difficulties or with language difficulties and blindness. And Germany isn't doing too great on that front either. And what we know in both of these cases is that changing beliefs can be done, but it's extraordinarily difficult. So I feel like Sisyphus. Yeah.
It seems, but the underlying assumption is that GBL or teaching with games is something that more teachers should be doing, though, right?
Yes, that is my underlying assumption, and actually I do question that as well. I mean, the research tells us that that's a great way to learn language, but there is this element that came up the other day in one of our conversations that I think, and came up here already, that a lot of students don't like the idea of bringing in their free time, leisure activities in a formal learning setting. And I think that's another really tricky aspect that I've ignored for far too long, is that we have a lot of kids and a lot of students and a lot of learners saying, don't you touch my games, leave us alone.
From my own experience, I haven't had that much resistance to it, but I know from the literature there's one by Reinhardt and Zander, right? The Chinese students use games.
Right, and I think, was that you, Adam, who talks about that when we first met in this chat this morning?
Yeah, that was me, and I've also talked with James too, and I've found his experiences to be almost polar opposite to what I have. So I think me and you have a little bit more shared ground here.